The Berbogay species had a saying, passed down through 17 generations of interstellar wandering. To see is to understand the surface. To hear is to know the soul. Katrina Furiosa had never understood the surface of anything. Born without the gift of sight that most of her kind possessed, a cruel irony for a species whose perception relied upon the symphony of echoes and vibrations that painted their universe in sound, she navigated existence through fragments, incomplete melodies, half-heard whispers of a world that remained forever just beyond her reach. She sat now in the chromatic drift, a cantina perched on the outer ring of Meridian Station 7, her posture impeccable despite the chaos surrounding her. Blue skin the color of a dying star's last breath caught the neon lights that pulsed through the establishment, magenta, violet, electric cyan, though she could not see them. Her hair, a cascade of luminescent azure that fell past her shoulders, seemed to absorb and reflect light simultaneously. Across her eyes stretched a band of dark material, not to hide disfigurement, but to protect those around her from the disconcerting emptiness of her opaque white irises. The blindfold was a courtesy. The loneliness was her burden alone. Her dress, crimson silk that flowed like liquid fire over the silver biosynthetic bodysuit beneath, was the only color she allowed herself. Red, she had been told, was the color of passion, of anger, of life itself. She wore it as a reminder that somewhere beneath the carefully constructed walls of indifference she had built across 47 standard years, something might still beat, might. The metallic purse in her lap contained nothing of value, a few credit chips, an identification crystal, a small audio recording device that she never used because she had learned long ago that recording memories only made their absence more painful. Around her, the cantina hummed with life. Conversations overlapped in 17 different languages, creating a tapestry of sound that her species should have found beautiful. Other Berbogays would have closed their eyes and swum through the acoustic landscape, reading emotions in the timbre of laughter, detecting lies in the micro-hesitations between words, feeling the pulse of the universe itself in the rhythm of 100 heartbeats. Katrina heard only noise. The war had taken many things from her people. Their homeworld of Valyria Prime, their population, reduced from 12 billion to a mere 300 million scattered across the galaxy, their traditional arts, their ancient libraries, their sacred songs. But what it had stolen from Katrina was more intimate, more devastating. It had taken her ability to feel. Not physically. She could still sense temperature, pressure, the vibration of air molecules against the luminescent marks that traced delicate patterns across her cheekbones. Those marks, bioluminescent organs that should have translated sound into emotional experience, flickered weakly whenever someone spoke nearby, but they no longer connected to anything deeper. The war had seen to that. 187 years ago, the Berbogay's High Council had made a decision. In the face of overwhelming loss, drowning in grief that threatened to consume their entire civilization, they had chosen survival over sensation. Through a combination of genetic modification and cultural conditioning, they had suppressed their species' ability to produce tears. The reasoning was sound, if horrifying. A people who could not cry could not be broken by sorrow. A people who could not weep could march forward into an uncertain future, unburdened by the weight of mourning. What they had not anticipated was the cascade effect. Without tears, grief had nowhere to go. It festered, it transformed, and slowly, generation by generation, the Berbogays had lost access to the full spectrum of emotional experience. Joy became contentment, love became attachment, anger became disapproval. And Katrina, born blind into a world that experienced existence through sound, had never developed even those diminished capacities. She was, as far as she could tell, the most emotionally dead being in a species of emotional ghosts. Until tonight. Another Sparkwater, The server's voice cut through her reverie, high-pitched, synthetic, belonging to a service android whose serial number she had memorized after her third visit to this establishment. Unit 17, Hospitality Series. "No," Katrina said. Her voice was smooth, controlled, utterly devoid of inflection. "I am waiting for someone." The mechanic from Bay 47. Katrina's luminescent marks flickered. "You track my appointments? I track everyone's appointments." The android's tone carried what might have been amusement. "It is how I ensure optimal table turnover. He arrives in approximately 4 minutes. Shall I prepare his usual? Engine coolant with a protein suspension?" That sounds disgusting. Humans have peculiar nutritional requirements. The android glided away, and Katrina returned to her isolation. She was here because her personal transport had suffered a cascading failure in its sonic navigation array, the very system that allowed her to pilot despite her blindness. The mechanic came highly recommended by Meridian Station's Port Authority, though their description had been unusual. Excellent with outdated systems. Unconventional methods, prone to singing. That last detail had given her pause. Burbogays had once been a species defined by song. The mist canticles, performed at the birth of every child, the harmonic recitations that accompanied coming-of-age ceremonies. The mourning frequencies that had once allowed entire communities to grieve together, their voices intertwining in complex harmonies that released sorrow into the void of space. All of it was gone now, forbidden. The High Council had outlawed traditional Burbogays music after the war, claiming that the songs carried embedded emotional triggers that could undo the genetic modifications, keeping their people stable. The Lullaby of Vera, the most ancient and powerful of all their songs, said to unlock the deepest wells of feeling in any who heard it, had been classified as a cultural weapon. Its melody was purged from all records. Its lyrics were erased from memory. Anyone caught singing it faced exile or worse. Katrina had never heard the lullaby. She had never heard any of the old songs. By the time she was born, her people had forgotten how to sing entirely. But sometimes, in the deepest hours of the station's artificial night, she wondered what it would feel like to hear music that actually meant something. The cantina's entrance chimed, announcing a new arrival, and Katrina's luminescent marks flickered in response to the change in air pressure. Footsteps approached, heavy, uneven, belonging to someone who had spent too many years working in variable gravity environments. The scent of industrial lubricant and recycled air reached her before the voice did. "You're the Burbogays with the broken nav system." She turned toward the sound. "You are the mechanic who sings?" A pause, then a laugh. Rough, genuine, carrying undertones of surprise, and something else she couldn't identify. "Word travels fast on this station. Yeah, that's me, Preston Del Rey, at your service." He slid into the seat across from her, and Katrina felt the table vibrate with the impact. The man was not graceful. There was no refinement in his movements, no elegance in the way he settled his weight. But there was something present about him, something that occupied space unapologetically. "Your reputation suggests competence," she said. "Your entrance suggests otherwise." Another laugh. "Fair enough. In my defense, I've been elbow-deep in a Caridian freighter's waste recycling system for the past 6 hours. My social graces took a hit." The android returned, placing a glass of something that smelled truly vile in front of the human. Katrina heard him take a long drink, followed by a satisfied exhale. "So," Preston said, "sonic navigation array. Those are tricky. Most mechanics won't touch them. Too specialized, too many ways to cause catastrophic feedback. But I've worked on a few. Can I ask why a Burbogays is using sonic nav? Thought you people could just, you know." Hear your way through space. The luminescent marks on her cheeks dimmed. Most Berberges can. Silence stretched between them. She waited for the inevitable questions, the awkward attempts at sympathy, the performative concern that species who could actually feel seemed to believe they owed to those who could not. Instead, Preston simply said, "Okay, when can I take a look at your ship?" Preston Delray had not always been a mechanic. Once, in a life that felt like it belonged to someone else entirely, he had been a mining engineer on the resource extraction platforms orbiting Kepler 442b. Honest work, dangerous work. The kind of work that left your hands permanently stained with compounds that no amount of scrubbing could remove, and your lungs perpetually coated with particulates that the company medical officers swore were within acceptable parameters. He had been good at it, not brilliant. Brilliance required ambition, and Preston had lost his ambition somewhere between his third cave-in and his fifth friend's funeral. But he had been reliable, competent, the kind of worker who showed up on time and left only when the job was done. Then the consortium war had swept through the outer colonies, and everything had changed. 3 years in a prisoner of war camp had a way of reshaping a man. Not the physical conditions, brutal as they were. Starvation, forced labor, the constant threat of violence from guards who saw their captives as something less than sentient. Those scars healed, or at least faded. What stayed with Preston was the silence. 17 months without hearing another voice. Isolation as punishment, as psychological warfare. As a reminder that in the vast emptiness of space, no one would hear you scream. He had started singing to survive. At first, just humming. Fragments of songs from his childhood on New Brisbane, tunes his grandmother had sung while she tended her rooftop garden. Then lyrics, half-remembered, stitched together with improvisation when memory failed. Then melodies he invented himself, crafted in the darkness to prove that he still existed, that he was still capable of creating something beautiful in a universe that seemed determined to destroy him. One of his fellow prisoners, an old Berberges historian named Corinthos, who had been captured during the sacking of the Archive Moon, had listened through the wall of their adjacent cells. During their rare moments of shared labor, the old alien had taught Preston songs, ancient songs, the historian had whispered, from before the emotional suppression, songs that carried the weight of an entire civilization's joy and sorrow. One song in particular. "This melody," Corinthos had said, his voice barely audible over the grinding of machinery, "must never be forgotten. It is the key to what we were, what we could be again. Promise me you will remember it." Preston had promised. 2 weeks later, Corinthos was dead, executed for cultural sedition after a guard overheard him humming. Now, 12 years after his liberation, Preston still sang. In the shower of his tiny quarters, in the engine bays where he worked, in the quiet moments between waking and sleeping, when the memories threatened to overwhelm him. He sang because silence still felt like death. Walking through Meridian Station's maintenance corridors toward Bay 47, he found himself humming again. The Berberges woman's ship was supposedly docked there, a personal transport of unusual design, according to the port records. He was curious about the sonic navigation array, a technology he had only encountered twice before, but he was more curious about the woman herself. Katrina Furiosa. The name had appeared in his Port Authority briefing, accompanied by a sparse biography that raised more questions than it answered. Berberges national, registered as mobility impaired, no listed occupation, no emergency contacts, no family connections, alone, his mind supplied. She's completely alone. The thought resonated uncomfortably with his own history. Bay 47's doors hissed open, revealing a ship that was unlike anything Preston had seen before. Sleek, silver, shaped like a teardrop, frozen in the moment before impact. Its hull was covered in intricate patterns that seemed to shift and flow as he watched, and he realized with a start that they were acoustic sensors, thousands of them, each one designed to capture and process sound waves with inhuman precision. "She navigates by listening to space itself," he murmured. "That's incredible." He approached the ship's access panel and began his diagnostic routine, connecting his handheld scanner to the vessel's systems. The damage was immediately apparent. A feedback cascade had burned out the primary acoustic processors, leaving the navigation array functional but blind. Blind in the same way its owner was blind. Ironic, he thought, or maybe just cruel. The repairs would take several hours, complex work requiring focus and precision. Preston settled himself on a maintenance cart, pulled up his holographic toolkit, and began disassembling the damaged components. An hour passed. 2. The station's artificial day cycle shifted toward evening, and the bay's lighting dimmed automatically in response. Preston worked in near darkness, his hands moving with the confidence of long practice, and gradually he became aware of a presence watching him. He turned slowly, careful not to startle the observer. Katrina Furiosa stood in the bay's entrance, her crimson dress a splash of color against the industrial grays and blues of the docking facility. Her blindfold caught what little light remained, and the luminescent marks on her cheeks glowed faintly, not with emotion, he sensed, but with effort. She was using them to locate him in space, painting a picture through sound and vibration. "You work late," she said. "I work until the job is done." Most mechanics would have requested an extension. The damage is extensive. Preston shrugged, though he knew she couldn't see the gesture. Most mechanics would have told you the array was beyond repair and tried to sell you a replacement. But I know these systems. They were designed by a genius, and geniuses leave Easter eggs in their work. Backdoors, redundancies the manuals don't mention. "You have found such a redundancy?" "Working on it." He gestured toward the open access panel, then caught himself. "Sorry, pointing at things. Forgot you can't—" "I am aware of the location of the access panel," Katrina interrupted. Her voice carried no irritation, no offense, simply statement of fact. "I can feel the changes in air pressure caused by your movements. The pointing was unnecessary, but not offensive." She moved further into the bay, her steps precise and measured. Preston watched her navigate the cluttered space with an ease that seemed almost preternatural, flowing around obstacles she could not see, as though they had announced themselves to her in advance. "Your marks," he said. "They help you see. They help me perceive. Seeing is something else entirely." She stopped a few meters from his work area. "You have been humming." Preston's hands stilled on the components he was holding. "Sorry. Habit. I can stop if—" "Why do you do it?" The question was simple. The answer was not. "Because 3 years of silence taught me that I need sound to stay human," he said finally. "Because making music, even bad music, even just humming to myself, proves that I'm still alive, that I still have something worth expressing." The marks on Katrina's cheeks flickered in a pattern he was beginning to recognize as curiosity. "You were imprisoned. During the Consortium War, 17 months in isolation, and someone taught you to sing." Preston's heart stuttered. "How did you know that? The melody you were humming. It is not human in origin. The tonal structure, the harmonic intervals, they belong to a species accustomed to producing and perceiving sounds across a wider frequency range than human vocal cords typically allow." She tilted her head, and the motion was strangely bird-like. "Someone modified the song for your voice. Someone who knew its original form intimately. He could lie, He could deflect, but something in her stillness, her isolation, her apparent inability to feel spoke to the parts of him that had never fully healed. His name was Corinthos, Preston said, Berberge's historian, captured when the archive moon fell. We were cellmates for nearly 2 years. The marks on Katrina's cheeks blazed suddenly, so bright that Preston threw up a hand to shield his eyes. Then they dimmed just as quickly, leaving only darkness. Corinthos the Keeper, she whispered, the last guardian of the harmonic archives. You knew him? Every Berberges knows of him. He was... She stopped, composed herself. When she spoke again, her voice was as flat and controlled as ever. He was executed for attempting to preserve forbidden cultural materials. The songs, Preston said. He taught me songs. Silence stretched between them, heavy with implications neither was ready to voice. Finally, Katrina spoke again, and there was something in her tone that Preston had not heard before. Something that might have been fear. Which songs, Mr. Del Rey? Which songs did Corinthos teach you? The chromatic drift was nearly empty now. The dinner crowd having given way to the quiet hours when only the truly lonely or the truly busy remained. Katrina sat across from Preston at a corner table, the remnants of a meal neither had tasted between them. She had asked him not to sing. Not yet. Not until she understood what she might be asking him to unleash. The High Council classified all traditional Berberges music as psychological weapons after the emotional suppression protocols were implemented, she explained, her voice low. The old songs were designed to trigger specific emotional responses that our modified neurology can no longer process safely. Exposure to the music could cause cascade failures in our emotional regulation systems. Meaning we could feel again, overwhelmingly, uncontrollably. The centuries of suppressed grief, rage, joy, all of it rushing back at once. Her marks flickered dimly. The Council believes it would drive us mad, that our civilization would collapse within a generation. Preston leaned back in his chair. So you've never heard any of the old music? Never. I was born after the ban. Most of my generation has never even heard a Berberge voice raised in melody. Her lips curved in what might have been bitter amusement on a face capable of expressing it. We speak, we do not sing. Song is considered primitive, dangerous. That's... Preston searched for the word. Tragic. It is practical. It's an entire culture cutting off its own soul to survive. The marks on her cheeks pulsed. You speak of souls as though they are measurable quantities, as though their presence or absence can be empirically determined. Can't they? Katrina had no answer for that. Preston was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands, those calloused, grease-stained hands that had rebuilt engines and rewired starship systems and once, in a prisoner of war camp 12 years ago, gently held the hand of a dying alien who had given him something precious. Corinthos taught me 4 songs, he said finally. 2 of them were what he called minor harmonics, simple melodies meant to evoke basic emotional states. Contentment. Alertness, the kind of thing a parent might hum to a child. And the other 2? One was a mourning song. He said it was sung at funerals before the war. He taught me only fragments. He couldn't bear to sing the whole thing even after all those years. Katrina's voice was barely audible. And the 4th? Preston met her unseeing gaze directly, as though she could see the weight of what he was about to say reflected in his eyes. He called it the Lullaby of Vera. He said it was the oldest song his people possessed, the key to everything they had lost. The luminescent marks on Katrina's cheeks blazed so brightly that diners at nearby tables turned to stare. She gripped the edge of the table, and Preston heard the synthetic material creak under the pressure. You know the lullaby, she said. You, A human, you carry the most forbidden melody in Berbogay's history in your memory. Corinthos made me promise to remember it. He said someone would need it someday, someone who had forgotten how to feel. If the council learns of this, they won't. You do not understand. Katrina's voice cracked, and the sound startled both of them. She had not known she was capable of producing such a sound. The council has agents everywhere. They monitor for cultural contamination. If you sing that melody where anyone can hear, then I'll sing it where no one can hear, Preston said calmly. Your ship's bay is acoustically isolated. Sound dampening fields on all 6 surfaces. I noticed when I was working on your nav array. Why would you take such a risk? It was a fair question, a reasonable question, the question that any sensible being would ask when confronted with a stranger offering to commit a crime that could result in both their deaths. Preston thought about Corinthos, about the old historian's trembling hands as he traced the forbidden melodies on the wall of their shared cell block, about the light in his eyes when he spoke of his people's lost heritage, about the promise extracted in whispers, sealed in blood, carried across years of trauma and recovery. Because Corinthos didn't die so that his song could stay silent, Preston said. Because I've spent 12 years wondering why he chose me to remember it. Because you're the first Berbergays I've met since his death, and you showed up at my door with a broken ship and an unbroken sadness that I recognize. Because I see it in the mirror every single day. He reached across the table and very gently touched the back of her hand. And because I think maybe this is why I survived, not to keep the melody safe, to share it with someone who needs it. Katrina's marks dimmed. When she spoke, her voice was steady, but something had shifted beneath its surface. Tomorrow night, Bay 47, after the maintenance shift changes. I'll be there. She rose from the table, her crimson dress flowing around her like liquid fire. At the entrance to the cantina, she paused. Mr. Del Rey. Yes. If this destroys me, if the council was right, and the music breaks what remains of my mind, I want you to know that I chose this. Whatever happens, I chose to feel. And then she was gone, leaving Preston alone with the ghost of a promise and the echo of a song. Bay 47 was silent. Preston had spent the afternoon triple-checking the sound-dampening fields, calibrating them to absorb even the faintest acoustic leakage. The station's automated systems had registered the bay as undergoing maintenance renovation, a status that would keep casual visitors away and explain any unusual energy consumption patterns. Katrina arrived precisely at the agreed-upon time, her movements carrying an urgency that Preston had not seen in her before. She had changed from her crimson dress into something simpler, a flowing robe in deep violet that left her arms bare, exposing the luminescent patterns that traced their way from her cheeks down her neck and across her shoulders. I was not certain I would come, she admitted, but you did. I did. She stood in the center of the bay, surrounded by the sleek curves of her still damaged ship, and something in her posture shifted, softened. I have spent 47 years feeling nothing, no joy, no sorrow, no love. I have been told this is normal, that it is the price of survival, that my ancestors made sacrifices so that I could exist without the burden of emotion. But existing is not living. The marks on her cheeks flickered. I watch other species laugh and weep and rage, and I do not envy them their chaos. I envy them their capacity to be moved, to be transformed, to be more than a collection of biological processes performing programmed behaviors. Preston moved to retrieve the small instrument he had brought with him, a stringed device of his own construction, built from salvaged ship components and tuned by ear to approximate the acoustic properties of ancient Berbogay's instruments. It was rough, imperfect, the work of an amateur who had learned music in darkness and never received formal training. It was the most precious thing he owned. "I'm not a great singer," he said, settling onto an equipment crate and positioning the instrument against his chest. "Corinthos told me my voice was serviceable, which in Berbogaise apparently means would make children cry, but not in a good way." Despite herself, despite everything, Katrina made a sound that might have been a laugh. He said that? Those exact words. Also, he frequently commented that human vocal range is charmingly limited, and that listening to me attempt harmonic complexity was like watching a three-legged creature try to perform traditional dance. Corinthos was known for his bluntness. He was honest. It's a rare quality. Preston's fingers found the strings, producing a soft chord that seemed to hang in the air. "Are you ready?" Katrina lowered herself to the baize floor, sitting cross-legged with her hands resting on her knees. The pose was formal, ceremonial, the traditional position for receiving music, Preston realized, inherited from a culture that no longer practiced it. "I do not know if I can ever be ready," she said, "but I am willing. That's enough." He began to play. The opening notes of the Lullaby of Vera were deceptively simple, a sequence of 5 tones that spiraled gently upward, each one slightly longer than the last. Corinthos had explained that the simplicity was intentional, designed to lull the listener into receptivity before the melody's true complexity emerged. Then Preston began to sing. His voice was rough, imperfect, colored by years of disuse and the permanent damage left by prisoner-of-war camps. He could not hit the highest notes, could not sustain the longest passages, could not produce the harmonic overtones that Berbogaise vocal anatomy made possible. But he had something that technical perfection could not replicate: sincerity. Corinthos had sung this melody for him in the darkness of their shared imprisonment, had wept luminescent tears that pooled like liquid stars on the cell floor, had poured the grief of an entire civilization into notes that Preston received without understanding. Now, 12 years later, Preston gave that grief back to the universe, shaped by human loss and human longing, and the uniquely human belief that beauty could emerge from even the deepest suffering. Katrina sat motionless. The luminescent marks on her face began to pulse in rhythm with the music, responding to frequencies they were designed to perceive but had never before encountered in this form. The pattern spread, racing down her neck and arms, igniting pathways that had been dormant since her birth. She felt it before she understood what was happening, a pressure building in her chest, uncomfortable and unfamiliar, a heat behind her eyes that intensified with each passing measure. Something cracking deep within her, walls she had not known existed, defenses she had inherited from 3 generations of emotional suppression. The song crescendoed, Preston's voice straining with the effort of conveying harmonies his vocal cords were never meant to produce. And the crack became a rupture, and the rupture became a flood. Pain. Not physical pain. This was worse, deeper, more encompassing. The pain of 17 generations of grief denied expression. The pain of an entire species choosing numbness over sensation. The pain of a woman who had spent 47 years believing she was fundamentally broken, that her inability to feel was a personal failure rather than a cultural wound. And then, beneath the pain, memory. Faces she had never seen. Parents, grandparents, ancestors stretching back to Valyria Prime. Voices she had never heard, speaking in the old tongue, singing in harmonies that made the universe vibrate with meaning. A whole history of emotion unfolding in her mind like a flower finally receiving sunlight. Her mother's voice, humming this same melody to an infant who could not see. Her grandmother's tears at the funeral of the old world. Generations of love and loss and triumph and tragedy, all compressed into notes that resonated in her cells themselves. And then, impossible, or what should have been impossible, Katrina felt wetness on her cheeks. Preston stopped singing. The bay fell silent, but the silence was different now. Fuller, pregnant with possibility. "Katrina." His voice was hesitant, worried. "Are you—" She raised a hand to her face, touched the moisture there, lifted her fingers to examine what she could not see. The luminescent marks on her skin were blazing now, brighter than they had ever been, and in their light she could perceive, for the first time in her life, through the unique perception that only her species possessed, the soft glow of her own tears. They shone like captured starlight. "I am crying," she whispered. "Preston, I am crying." He set aside his instrument and moved toward her, kneeling so that they were at the same level. "Does it hurt?" "Yes." Another tear fell, leaving a trail of light down her cheek. "It hurts more than anything I have ever experienced." "Do you want me to stop? No!" She reached out blindly, found his hands, gripped them with desperate strength. "No, this pain is mine. This grief belongs to me. For the first time in my life, I'm feeling something real, something that connects me to everyone who came before me, and I will not let it go." More tears came, rivers of light pouring down her face, pooling in her hands, dripping onto the cold floor of Bay 47. She wept for her people's lost world. She wept for Corinthos, who had died preserving this melody. She wept for every Berbergaze child who had never learned to sing, every elder who had forgotten what joy felt like, every soul crushed under the weight of survival at any cost. And somewhere in the weeping, she found something she had not expected. Laughter. Not hysterical laughter, this was something gentler, the surprised joy of discovery, the relief of finally releasing pressure that had built for decades. She laughed and cried simultaneously, emotions tumbling over each other like children at play, and the luminescent marks covering her body pulsed in patterns that painted the air itself with light. Preston watched in awe as the bay filled with colors he had no names for, projected by the Berbergaze woman's transformed biology. Grief blues and anger reds and joy golds, all swirling together in a symphony of visible emotion. "It's beautiful," he breathed. Katrina's tears slowed. Her breathing steadied. But when she turned toward his voice, her unseeing eyes somehow found his face with perfect accuracy. "You gave me this," she said. "You, a human, a species we once dismissed as emotionally primitive. You carried our most sacred song across years and light years and gave it back to us, to me. Corinthos gave it to me first. You remembered, when remembering was dangerous, when forgetting would have been easier." She squeezed his hands. "That is not a small thing, Preston Del Rey. That is everything." They sat together in the light of her tears until the bay's environmental systems automatically brightened, signaling the beginning of a new day cycle. Neither of them noticed. Word spread faster than light. Within 2 days of Katrina's awakening, rumors had reached every Berbergaze settlement in the sector. A woman born without sight had wept tears of light. A human mechanic had sung the Lullaby of Vera. The forbidden melody still existed, preserved in the memory of an enemy species prisoner who had shared a cell with the legendary Corinthos. The reactions were mixed. Some, mostly the young, those who had never known the old ways but had heard whispered stories, expressed hope. Perhaps the emotional suppression protocols had been wrong. Perhaps their people could learn to feel again without descending into madness. Others, the council loyalists, the elders who remembered the chaos of the post-war era, were terrified. The lullaby was dangerous precisely because it worked. If one Berbergaze could be awakened, others might follow, and if emotional awakenings spread beyond control. Elder Vorathis, chairman of the Cultural Purity Committee, arrived on Meridian Station 7 exactly 72 hours after the event. His shuttle's docking sent ripples of anxiety through the station's Berbogese population. Vorathis was known for his zealotry, his conviction that the suppression protocols had saved their species, and his willingness to take extreme measures to preserve them. Katrina and Preston were having dinner in the chromatic drift when the enforcers arrived. There were 7 of them, dressed in the stark white uniforms of the Cultural Integrity Division. They moved through the cantina with military precision, surrounding the corner table where the unlikely pair had shared meals for 3 consecutive nights. "Katrina Furiosa," the lead enforcer intoned. "You are summoned before the Cultural Purity Committee on suspicion of voluntary exposure to forbidden cultural materials. You will accompany us immediately." Katrina rose slowly, her luminescent marks pulsing with an emotion Preston had learned to recognize as determination. "I will answer the committee's questions, and the human—" The enforcer's voice carried a cold edge. "Preston Delray, formerly of the New Brisbane Mining Consortium, you are charged with cultural contamination in the 1st degree. The penalty is—" "I know what the penalty is." Preston stood as well, positioning himself slightly in front of Katrina. "I'll answer for my actions, but I want it on record that Katrina didn't know what I was going to sing. She didn't seek out forbidden materials. If anyone is guilty of cultural contamination here, it's me. That will be determined by the committee." They were escorted through the station's corridors, drawing stares from beings of a dozen species. Word of the arrest spread quickly through social networks and communication channels, and by the time they reached the temporary tribunal chamber that had been established in a converted cargo bay, a crowd had gathered outside. Most were Berbogese. Many were young, and many, Preston noticed with surprise, had luminescent marks that flickered with visible emotion. The tribunal chamber was stark and cold, designed to intimidate rather than inspire. Elder Vorathis sat at the center of a curved bench, flanked by 4 other council representatives. His skin was the pale blue of old ice, and his eyes held the flat emptiness of one who had suppressed emotion for so long that he had forgotten it ever existed. "The charges are serious," Vorathis began. "Cultural contamination, voluntary decontamination, possession and distribution of forbidden cultural materials." He turned his empty gaze toward Preston. "The human will sing the melody in question. The committee will assess its nature and determine appropriate penalties." Preston felt Katrina stiffen beside him. "Elder Vorathis," she said, "I request permission to speak." "Denied. The human will perform the forbidden song." "Why?" Preston asked. "If the melody is so dangerous, why would you want it sung in a room full of people?" Vorathis's lips curved in something that might have been a smile. "Because when you sing it and nothing happens, when this crowd witnesses that your miracle was fraud or delusion, the threat you represent will be neutralized. Our people will see that the old songs have no power, and this foolish hope for emotional restoration will die. And if something does happen, it will not. Our modifications are stable. They have protected us for almost 2 centuries. One human voice cannot undo the work of 17 generations." Preston looked at Katrina. Her marks were steady, glowing with quiet light. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. He began to sing. The opening notes filled the chamber, absorbed by its walls, reflected by its surfaces. The committee members shifted uncomfortably, but their expressions remained blank. Vorathis watched with cold satisfaction. Then Preston reached the melody's heart. The section Corinthos had called the awakening phrase, a sequence of notes designed to bypass conscious resistance and speak directly to the deep brain structures that processed emotion. Preston sang it with everything he had, pouring 12 years of grief and longing and impossible hope into tones that his human voice was never meant to produce. Nothing happened. For a long moment, Preston felt despair rising in his chest. Varathis had been right. One human voice, imperfect and limited, could not reach these people, could not break through modifications designed to resist exactly this. Then a sound emerged from the crowd. A woman's voice, high and clear, picking up the melody where Preston's limited range faltered. Then another voice, lower, harmonizing. Then a third, a fourth, a dozen. Young Berberges who had heard the rumors, who had secretly hoped, who now felt something stirring within them that their elders had tried to bury forever. The song grew. It spread through the chamber like fire through dry wood, each voice adding depth and complexity that Preston alone could never have achieved. The harmonics that Corinthos had described, the overtones that human vocal cords could not produce, emerged from Berberges' throats that had never sung before, but somehow knew the music in their bones. Elder Varathis rose from his seat, his face contorted with an expression that might have been fury, genuine fury, the first real emotion he had allowed himself to feel in decades. "Silence," he commanded. "You will cease this," his voice cracked. The committee members were gripping their bench, their carefully maintained composure crumbling. One of them, a younger representative who had been appointed only the previous year, had tears streaming down her face, leaving trails of light that dripped onto the cold floor. And the song continued. Katrina stepped forward, her crimson dress flowing around her, her luminescent marks blazing with an intensity that seemed to light the entire chamber. She had never sung before in her life, had never known the shapes her mouth could make, the sounds her throat could produce. But the melody was part of her now, written into her DNA by ancestors who had refused to let it die completely. She added her voice to the chorus. The chamber exploded with light. Every Berberges present, young and old, loyalist and rebel, those who had hoped and those who had despaired, began to weep. Luminescent tears poured down their faces, decades of suppressed emotion finally finding release. Some fell to their knees, others embraced strangers beside them. The sound of weeping mixed with laughter, mixed with song in a cacophony that should have been chaos, but somehow became harmony. Even Elder Varathis wept. He stood at his bench, tears of pale silver running down his ancient cheeks, and his expression held something that Preston recognized from his own mirror in the years after his imprisonment, the devastating relief of finally letting go. When the song ended, the chamber fell silent, but it was not the silence of suppression. It was the silence of exhausted catharsis, of souls wrung clean and left trembling in the aftermath of revelation. Katrina turned to face the committee. Her voice was steady, but carried an undertone of power that had not been there before. We were told that emotion was weakness, that to feel was to be vulnerable, that our ancestors made us numb to protect us. She gestured at the weeping assembly behind her. But look at what we have lost. Look at what we have denied ourselves. We have survived, yes, but survival without feeling is not life, it is mere existence. She moved toward Varathis, and the old politician flinched but did not retreat. The lullaby of Vera was never a weapon, she said softly. It was a key to who we truly are. Corinthos knew this. He died to preserve it. And Preston Del Rey, she turned toward the human who had started everything, carried it across years of suffering because he believed that someday someone would need it. She took Varathis's hands. The old man's tears were still falling, and his luminescent marks flickered with emotions he could not name. We needed it, she said, all of us, even you. 1 year later, Meridian Station 7 hosted the first festival of restored song. The chromatic drift had been transformed for the occasion, its neon lights supplemented by the natural luminescence of hundreds of Berberges who had learned to feel again. Music filled the air, some traditional, some newly composed, some strange hybrids created by human Burbo-gaze collaborations that would have been unthinkable a generation ago. At a corner table, Katrina Furiosa and Preston Del Rey shared a meal and watched the celebration unfold. She no longer wore a blindfold. The treatment developed in the months following the awakening, a combination of genetic therapy and sonic implant technology, had not restored her sight, but it had enhanced her perception to the point where she could navigate visually through sound in ways that even sighted Burbo-gaze found remarkable. She could not see Preston's face, but she could perceive his warmth, hear the rhythm of his heartbeat, sense the slight changes in air pressure when he smiled. It was enough. It was more than enough. "I received a message from the council today," she said, her voice carrying the melodic undertones that had emerged after her awakening. "They want me to lead the Cultural Restoration Initiative. That's big." "It is." She reached across the table and found his hand with practiced ease. "I told them I would accept on one condition, which is that you be appointed as human cultural liaison. They were initially resistant. Traditionalists still prefer to work with their own species, but I pointed out that without you, there would be nothing to restore." Preston laughed, and the sound made her marks pulse with reflected joy. "I'm a mechanic, Katrina. I fix things. I don't know anything about cultural restoration." "You fixed me." Her grip tightened on his hand. "You fixed all of us. That counts for something." They sat in comfortable silence as the festival swirled around them. Somewhere nearby, a young Burbo-gaze was teaching a group of human children the opening notes of the lullaby, adapting the melody for their limited vocal range. Somewhere else, an elder who had once served on the Cultural Purity Committee was weeping openly while listening to a song she had thought she would never hear again. "I have a question," Preston said finally. "Ask. Just when you cried that first time, when you heard the lullaby in Bay 47, what did you actually feel? What was the first emotion?" Katrina was quiet for a long moment. The marks on her cheeks flickered through a complex pattern that Preston had learned to recognize as deep contemplation. "I felt grief," she said finally, "for everyone we lost, for the world that used to be, for the years I spent believing I was broken when I was simply waiting." And after the grief, she smiled. The expression still felt new on her face, even after a year of practice. "Hope," she said. "I felt hope." Preston raised his glass, engine coolant with protein suspension, his usual, and Katrina raised hers in response. "To hope, then," he said. "To hope. And to the song that never stopped singing, even when we forgot how to listen." They drank together, and outside the cantina's windows, the stars continued their eternal dance, indifferent to the small miracles unfolding beneath their light. But for the first time in almost 2 centuries, the Burbo-gaze people were not indifferent. They felt the beauty of those stars in their bones, wept at their coldness, and celebrated their brightness, and remembered what it meant to be fully, gloriously, magnificently alive. And it had all begun with a blind woman who had never cried, and a mechanic who refused to stop singing. The end.